So for those of you who haven't read Seneca's version of the myth, I'll give a really quick little summary. So Theseus has gone on a quest to the underworld, leaving his wife Phaedra alone with his son, her stepson Hippolytus. Phaedra falls madly in love with Hippolytus and then accuses him of rape when he rejects her. Theseus calls down a curse upon his son, and Hippolytus is chased down by a sea monster while riding his chariot and is torn to pieces by his own horses. The play ends with Theseus learning the rape was fake, and he's left to piece together his son's broken body. So just from that description, we can clearly see that this play has elements of what we would now call horror. And yet many scholars trying to reconcile horror, the horror in Seneca's tragedies with his Stoic philosophy have been left puzzled by it. Some of them have called it, quote, grotesque, formless, and tasteless, and some believe that the horror is completely at odds with Stoic philosophy, while others just think it's part of a cautionary tale, and others think it's simply a way to grab audience attention or fulfill a, quote, perverse Roman bloodthirstiness. Now, I would argue these interpretations neglect to understand the nature of horror. It is grotesque, but it's by no means formless nor tasteless. Horror serves a purpose. Eric Gunderson calls Senecan tragedies, quote, places to explore ideas. So places where Seneca can ask questions that don't always have a straightforward Stoic answer. I propose Seneca uses horror as a tool in performing these experiments. So I'm going to follow 3 different instances of horror in Phaedra: Seneca's creation of atmosphere, his description of the monster, and his description of Hippolytus's body. And I'm going to analyze them through 3 concepts of horror literature: the macabre, the grotesque, and the abject. Ultimately, I'm going to argue that horror complicates and challenges orthodox Stoic ideas of living in accordance with nature. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about horror and its relation to Stoicism. Basically, Orthodox Stoicism conceived of a natural world that was ordered by reason. We were supposed to live in accordance with nature, which means a moderate and rational lifestyle that avoids overwhelming emotion. Now, based on that, horror seems completely at odds with Stoicism. The iconic horror writer H.P. Lovecraft said, quote, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Now, this seems completely at odds with Stoicism. Lovecraft conceives of a irrational, primal emotion that stirs up, horror is meant to stir up emotions in the audience. But Lovecraft also says that this emotion is old and innate. It's natural, which complicates that simple binary between horror and Stoicism. So this, I think, is the crucial function of horror. It complicates, and fear is often revelatory. We see this with Hippolytus, who appears to represent an extreme version of Stoicism. He totally immerses himself in nature and rejects desire. But when it's stripped back, we see that he is actually driven by emotion. And the horror in Seneca's tragedy does the same thing to the audience, to the Stoics. It muddles their clear views on the principles of Stoicism. So now we're going to turn to the first instance of horror in the play, the creation of atmosphere. And for this, I'm going to introduce the idea of the macabre, which is a literary mood, so focusing on the feelings it evokes in the audience. And it means everything that's connected to death and the realm of death, everything that's dark and dreadful and ominous. So for the first 3/4 of the play or so, we really only get foreshadowing of this gruesome end. And we know that the audience was likely familiar with the myth, so they knew that Hippolytus was going to die, but they didn't know all the gory details, and so this creates this ever-looming sense of dread, and that's the macabre taking hold of the audience. And this all comes to a head in passage 1 on your handouts about Hippolytus' fatal chariot ride. Quote, Then, all of a sudden, the depths of the ocean resounded. The noise rang up to the sky. No wind blew on the water, and no part of the silent sky had caused the sound. A tempest of its own had roused the quiet sea. As we stood aghast at the flood, see, all of a sudden, the sea gave a roar, and the cliffs all around were singing. So as this unknown thing is emerging from the ocean, every aspect of the natural environment, the ocean, the sky, the cliffs, is transforming from natural and familiar to unnatural and eerie. This is the macabre intruding into the normal world. The macabre is inherently ambiguous. It connects the natural world of the living to the supernatural underworld. And so it's both natural and unnatural, horrifically real and fantastic at the same time. And we see this in Theseus' journey to the underworld in this play. He's been to the literal realm of death, but when he returns to the land of the living, he finds it to be, quote, worse than hell itself. And so we have this transition from the rational, stoic, natural world to something that's horrifically other. And if this nature is the basis of stoic virtue, then the macabre starts to complicate stoicism itself. So moving on to our next instance of horror, that's the monster, and I'm going to introduce the idea of the grotesque for this. Now, this actually comes from visual arts, so I'm going to show you some examples of grotesque art, and just kind of be aware of your initial reaction to them. So we have this, and this guy. Ooh. The grotesque is imagery that is disgustingly and absurdly abnormal, often deformed and monstrous, but at its core, it's something familiar, like those hands. It's something that is normal or natural that's then perverted, and so we see it from a new and strange perspective. Now, in Euripides' version of the Hippolytus myth, the monster is simply a bull, which means Seneca has intentionally altered the monster to be grotesque, which we can see in passage 2 on your handout. It was a bull. How huge he was. His bulk loomed high as he lifted his blue back from the water. A green mane flowed from his gigantic head. His ears were hairy. His eyes flashed multicolored. He was the type of animal the sea-born king would own, lord of a savage herd. At times his eyes spurt fire, at other times they shine blue light. His sturdy back was ridged with muscles, and his nostrils flared as he huffed and puffed great draughts of air. Green mosses stuck to his underside in dewlaps, while his vast flanks were covered with red seaweed. Finally, the monster gathers his huge rear from the water, dragging his vast and scaly folds of flesh, like the Leviathan of the distant seas. So I think the bodily emphasis in this passage is really interesting. It's breaking down the creature into separate body parts, its mane, its eyes, its back, and this distorts our mental image. It's just a bunch of body parts that are stuck together, so the image in your mind isn't really a unified whole, it's something grotesque. But more importantly, it's very clearly rooted in nature. It comes from the sea, which means the source of the horror is nature. And it's a bull, which is a familiar animal. It's covered in plants, it's blue and green. These are colors we normally associate with nature. But really, these natural things are unnatural. And hopefully we all know that real bulls aren't blue and green, and they're not scaly, and they definitely don't have eyes that are shooting out fire and light. So we can't really call it a bull. It's a grotesque monster. When we say that the grotesque can offer new perspectives, it's not just visually, but I think ideologically. By perverting Stoic nature, the grotesque can compel Stoics to consider new and unusual views of their own ideology. Okay, so moving on to the third case, we have the destruction of Hippolytus' body. Hippolytus bloodied the countryside. His shattered skull bounced down the rocks and thorns tore off his hair. His beautiful face was ruined by the hard stone ground. His unlucky loveliness was lost in all these wounds. The chariot wheels rolled over his still twitching limbs. At last, a charred branch from a tree trunk pierced him, right in the middle of his groin, and held him fast. The horses pause a little way away from their gored master, attached to his wounded body. Then all at once they break, making an end of their owner and delay. The thickets cut the half-dead corpse, and thorns with their sharp brambles. Parts of the body were stuck to every tree. So we can clearly see the grotesque in this again. It's talking about how beautiful Hippolytus is. He's not just the norm, but the ideal. And it's contrasting that really sharply with his gory disfigurement. But I think there's something more going on here, and that's where the idea of the abject comes in, which is a really complex idea from Julia Kristova's book, Powers of Horror. But essentially, it's something that disturbs identity and boundaries, and breaks down the norm and the meaning behind the norm. And it causes a physical reaction of revulsion and rejection. This is really clear when you consider the idea of a dead body. Kristeva, in fact, says, quote, "The corpse is the utmost of objection. It is no longer I who expel. I is expelled. It is death infecting life." So what she means is that a dead body was once a person, which had meaning and identity, and now in death, it no longer has that meaning. So the body can't really be called a person anymore. This blurring of boundaries between life and death is what's so horrific to us. So we can see the abject in the destruction of Hippolytus's body. Much like the monster, Hippolytus is described as body parts. But unlike the monster, these parts no longer make up a whole. He's literally broken down into separate pieces. And so the body no longer has meaning. He's no longer Hippolytus. He's just bloody bits. This is even more apparent in Theseus' attempt to piece back together his son, which is an attempt to regain that meaning. He fails because some of the body parts are missing, and some of the other parts he can't even recognize. These body parts have become totally abject, and the thing that Theseus pieces back together can't really be called a body, let alone a person. Now, it's notable that nature makes Hippolytus' body abject. The rocks and the thorns and the tree branches destroy him, and because it's strewn all across nature, it's impossible to collect all the body parts and make the whole again. Hippolytus becomes one with nature in a way, which is the Stoic ideal, but this is horrific, not virtuous. And so the very foundation of Stoic virtue is being disturbed by the abject. The abject is really the culmination of those three concepts of horror that I've been talking about. If the macabre changes nature and complicates Stoicism, and the grotesque perverts and challenges it, the abject destabilizes the very meanings and understandings at the core of Stoic ideology. So why is Seneca doing all this? I'm not trying to suggest that he wants to destroy his own philosophy. Rather, I would argue he's trying to broaden the limits of Stoicism and critically analyze its principles. I think we can find this in Hippolytus' character, which is actually sort of another occurrence of the grotesque in the play. Hippolytus is initially presented as the Stoic ideal. He chooses to reject the corrupting influences of sex and human society and literally live in nature. This is taking Stoic ideology to the extreme. And yet, he's not really the Stoic ideal at all, because he rejects sex and retreats to the forest, not out of Stoic rationality, but out of emotion. He hates women, and he admits that this hatred brings him pleasure. So his seemingly ideal Stoicism is actually a grotesque distortion of the philosophy. But Hippolytus is adamant that his way is the right way, and this only makes him more grotesque. Jeffrey Harpam has this idea of the internally grotesque character, in which taking a truth to the extreme and claiming it to be the one and only truth usually ends up making it a falsehood. Think of a religious or political zealot, for example, someone who might even claim to be coming from the same place as you, but they take it to such extremes that it becomes a perversion. Hippolytus is so certain that his extreme version of Stoicism is correct that he's blind to alternative understandings, like those of the nurse, for example, who says maybe human society and sex are part of nature. And I think in this, Seneca is adhering to another principle of Stoicism, moderation. But of course, because horror makes things complicated, he's presenting a more complicated view of moderation. Moderation even in one's practice of Stoicism. So he's still coming from his Stoic perspective, but by depicting horror, he can challenge and question and expand the limits of that Stoic perspective. So scholars who call horror in Senecan tragedies meaningless gore are missing the complicating and challenging elements of horror. In Phaedra, horror forces the audience to see new perspectives and the potential failings of its own ideas. Seneca probes the bounds of Stoic interpretation, while warning against the dangers of claiming simple and absolute truths that make you blind to other possibilities. And so, let's turn back to Lovecraft's famous definition of horror once more. Fear of the unknown. I think it can be said that horror in Seneca's Phaedra is terrifying, particularly to Orthodox Stoics, because it makes what was thought to be known into something unknown, or at least something far more complex than it was thought to be. So that concludes my presentation. Are there any questions?
Thanks so much, Jenny. That was really awesome.
Thank you.
So one thing that maybe you could add to your argument that you might want to think about is like a really frequent method of consolation that Seneca uses in his philosophical works to like make us feel better about death and dying is like, oh, once we die, our soul kind of scatters into the natural world and we kind of become reabsorbed into nature and, just become like part of the natural world basically in this scattering way. And I think that kind of parallels Hippolytus' death in a really interesting way that like, on the one hand, Hippolytus' death is kind of stoic because it's like he's being dispersed back into nature, but it's his body instead of his soul, and it's like disgusting. So yeah, I don't know, that could kind of add to your argument.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was a really great presentation. So I was noticing in the middle of passage 3, these lines, at last charred branch from a tree trunk pierced him right in the middle of his groin. And there's obviously a very sexual connotation to that, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on how that's interacted with the horror and also with Hippolytus' continued refusal of sex.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, oftentimes horror and sex are like really tied together. Like, I mean, any horror movie from the early 2000s, you look at that and it's all just like a metaphor for abstinence or something, right? I think the bodily focus of horror and bodily involvement of sex are like really intimately tied, so it can cross over very easily. Great.